Imagine you are walking home alone in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. The time well past 2:00 a.m., and the humidity of the summer night makes the air feel heavy and suffocating against your skin. The city that supposedly never sleeps has momentarily closed its eyes, leaving you in a disturbing silence that is only broken by the distant, rhythmic clatter of a subway train passing underground. You hear footsteps behind you, matching your pace perfectly, and when you stop to tie your shoe, the footsteps behind you cease instantly, sending a jolt of primal fear straight down your spine. You turn around, expecting to see a neighbor or a stray cat, but instead, you see a silhouette standing perfectly still in the shadows of a scaffolding, watching you with an intensity that makes your blood run cold. Before we dive into this terrifying story of urban isolation and the unknown, please gently press the like button as if you are trying not to wake up a sleeping roommate. This small act helps the channel immensely and allows us to keep bringing you these strange, dark, and mysterious stories 3, 4, or even 5 times a week. Today's case takes us deep into the concrete jungle of New York City, where millions of people live, stacked on top of each other. Yet it is arguably the easiest place in the world to disappear or to be hunted in plain sight. The year was 1999, a time when Manhattan was transitioning from its gritty, dangerous past into the polished metropolis we know today. But dark shadows still lingered in the alleyways and old tenements. Elena Russo was 24 years old, full of ambition and naive optimism, having just moved from the quiet town in Ohio to pursue her dreams of becoming a high-end graphic designer. She had secured a small, overpriced studio apartment in the East Village, a neighborhood known for its artistic flair and vibrant nightlife, which seemed like the perfect backdrop for the life she had always imagined for herself. Elena loved the chaotic energy of the city, spending her days working at a boutique advertising agency in Midtown, and her evenings exploring the eclectic bars and cafes near her apartment. She often told her parents back home that the noise of the city was comforting, a constant reminder that she was part of something bigger and more important than herself. However, the East Village had a duality to it. While the avenues were bustling with hipsters and tourists during the day, the side streets could feel incredibly desolate and menacing once the bars closed, and the streetlights flickered against the worn brick buildings. Her apartment building was a pre-war walk-up with creaky floors, thin walls, and a front door that didn't always latch significantly unless you slammed it hard with your hip. A quirk the landlord refused to fix. It was the kind of place where you knew your neighbors by the sounds of their footsteps rather than their faces, creating a strange intimacy devoid of actual connection. Elena felt safe enough, or at least as safe as anyone really feels in a city of 8 million strangers, often leaving her window cracked open to let in the cool night breeze and the distant sirens that served as the city's lullaby. Life fell into a predictable rhythm for the first few months, with long hours at the office, followed by cheap takeout and sketching in her sketchbook until she fell asleep on her futon. But usually, in stories like this, the comfort of routine is exactly what blinds us to the subtle changes happening in our environment until it is far too late to react or escape. It started with small things that Elena dismissed as the quirks of living in an old building, like objects on her dresser seeming slightly shifted, or the feeling of a draft in a room where the windows were definitely closed. The vibrant autumn turned into a harsh, biting winter, driving people off the streets earlier and leaving the city feeling colder and more hostile than before. The darkness seemed to stretch longer into the day, and the walk from the subway station to her apartment began to feel less like an adventure and more like a gauntlet she had to run. She began to notice a recurring figure standing near the bodega on her corner, a man who never seemed to be buying anything, but always had his gaze fixed on the entrance of her building as she hurried inside, his face always obscured by a hood or the shadows. Elena was not the type to be easily spooked, having grown up with 3 older brothers who delighted in playing pranks. So she rationalized the man's presence as just another fixture of the quirky neighborhood. She even joked about the sentinel to her coworker, Sarah, laughing off the creeping sensation of unease that settled in her stomach whenever she passed him. He's probably just a lonely guy looking for a connection or somewhere to stay warm, she said, trying to convince herself that her instincts were wrong and that the city hadn't hardened her heart to the plight of the less fortunate souls around her. However, The psychological barrier she had built began to crumble one Tuesday night when she woke up abruptly at 3:15 a.m., her heart hammering against her ribs for no apparent reason. The room was silent, but the air felt charged, as if someone had just spoken or moved mere inches from her face, leaving behind a lingering sense of intrusion. She sat up and scanned the small studio, her eyes adjusting to the gloom, and although she saw nothing, she noticed that the interior latch of her front door was unlocked. Despite her vivid memory of turning it before bed, she attributed the unlocked door to exhaustion and stress, promising herself she would be more careful. But the feeling of being observed began to bleed into her daylight hours as well. At work, she would catch movement in her peripheral vision, and on the subway, she constantly felt eyes boring into the back of her neck. Though she could never identify a source, it was as if the mystery man she had seen on the street corner had dissolved into the very atmosphere of the city, becoming an omnipresent force that surrounded her. One Friday evening, after a particularly grueling week at work where she had stayed late to finish a project, Elena returned home to find something that shattered her carefully constructed sense of security. As she unlocked her door and stepped into the dark apartment, the smell of stale cigarette smoke hit her instantly. Despite the fact that she had never smoked a day in her life, and neither did her friends, she froze in the doorway, her hand trembling on the light switch, realizing with a sickening clarity that someone had been inside her sanctuary while she was gone, and she had no way of knowing if they were still there. Waiting in the darkness, Elena stood frozen in her entryway, her hand still gripping the cold brass doorknob. While the acrid scent of cigarette smoke swirled around her like a phantom, she finally summoned the courage to flip the light switch, half expecting to illuminate an intruder sitting on her futon. But the sudden flood of yellow light revealed an empty, silent apartment. Dropping her bag on the floor, she grabbed a heavy umbrella from the corner and began a trembling search of the small space, checking the closet, the shower, and even under the bed. There was no one there. Yet the smell was undeniable and fresh, hanging heavy in the air as proof that her sanctuary had been violated only moments before she arrived. She immediately called the building superintendent, a grumpy man named Mr. Henderson, who lived in the basement, and demanded he come up to inspect the locks. When he arrived, smelling of garlic and indifference, he barely glanced at the doorframe before shrugging his shoulders and dismissing her concerns with a wave of his hand. "Look, lady, these old buildings have vents that connect everything," he grunted, not bothering to make eye contact. Probably just the guy downstairs smoking a pack a day, and the draft brought it up here. Elena wanted to believe him. She desperately wanted to accept that logical explanation, but she knew deep down that the windows were closed, and she had never smelled smoke in her unit before that specific night. Despite Mr. Henderson's dismissal, Elena refused to take chances with her safety and paid a locksmith $300. She didn't really have to install a deadbolt the very next morning. The solid click of the new lock sliding into place gave her a temporary sense of control, a physical barrier between her and the chaotic city outside. For a few weeks, the feeling of dread began to recede, and she convinced herself that her overactive imagination, fueled by true crime novels and exhaustion, had simply gotten the better of her. The smoke smell never returned, and the apartment once again felt like the safe haven she needed after long days of designing ad campaigns. However, the peace was short-lived, shattering late one Tuesday evening when her landline telephone began to ring incessantly. It was almost midnight, a time when only bad news travels, and when she picked up, she was met with a silence that was somehow loud in its intensity. "Hello, is anyone there?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly in the quiet room. There was no answer, but she could hear the rhythmic sound of breathing on the other end, slow and deliberate, before the line went dead with a soft click. She told herself it was a wrong number, but the calls continued every night at the same time, always silent, always listening. The sentinel, the man who stood on the corner, also changed his behavior during this period, escalating from a passive observer to an active participant in her daily nightmare. Instead of staying across the street by the bodega, he moved to the scaffolding directly adjacent to her building's entrance, forcing her to walk within mere feet of him to get inside. He never spoke, never reached out, but his head would turn slowly to track her movements, his face hidden deep within the hood of a dirty gray sweatshirt. Elena began to time her arrivals to when other people were entering the building, using her neighbors as unwitting human shields to avoid being alone with him on the sidewalk. One particularly rainy night, as Elena was rushing home from the subway station with her head down against the wind, she felt the distinct vibration of heavy footsteps syncing with hers. She stopped abruptly to pretend to check her phone, and the footsteps behind her stopped as well. Not instantly, but a fraction of a second later, as if the person had reacted to her pause. She turned around and saw a figure about half a block away, standing perfectly still under a broken street lamp, their silhouette blurred by the driving rain. It was too far to identify the face, but the gray hooded sweatshirt was unmistakable, and for the first time, she realized he wasn't just watching her building, he was following her from the train. Panic surged through her veins, overriding all logic, and she bolted the rest of the way home, fumbling with her keys in a terrified frenzy that made it almost impossible to open the vestibule door. She slammed it shut behind her and leaned against the glass, gasping for air, watching the street outside through the condensation of her breath. The street was empty now, the figure gone, but the feeling of being hunted had settled deep into her bones. Cold and unshakable, she ran up the 3 flights of stairs to her apartment, locking all 3, locks the knob, the deadbolt, and the chain before collapsing onto her floor in tears. The next morning, as she left for work, bleary-eyed from a sleepless night spent clutching a kitchen knife, she found a small object resting precisely in the center of her doormat. It was a single, silver hoop earring, cheap and tarnished, the kind you buy at a street fair for $5. Elena's breath hitched in her throat because she recognized it immediately. It was one of her favorite pairs, one she thought she had lost on the subway weeks ago, but she hadn't lost it on the subway. It had been returned to her doorstep, placed there with care. A silent message that said, "I have been close to you, and I can get close again." She took the earring to the nearest police precinct, hoping that physical evidence would finally prompt them to take action against the man in the gray hoodie. The officer at the desk looked at the piece of jewelry and then at her with a mix of pity and annoyance, clearly overwhelmed with real crimes. "Miss, unless he threatened you, touched you, or broke in, there's not much we can do about a guy standing on a public street," he explained in a tired monotone. "Returning lost property isn't a crime, and silent phone calls are hard to trace without a court order, which you won't get for this." Elena left the station feeling smaller and more isolated than ever before, realizing that the system she thought would protect her was entirely indifferent to her fear. She was on her own in a city of millions, trapped in a leash she couldn't break and a job she couldn't quit, with a shadow that was slowly closing in. That night, she didn't sleep at all, sitting by her window with the lights off, watching the street below through the blinds. At 3:00 a.m., she saw him, the gray hoodie, standing directly across from her building. But this time, he wasn't looking at the front door. His head was tilted back, staring straight up at her third-floor window. The following week dissolved into a blur of sleep deprivation and paranoid delusions, transforming Elena from a vibrant young professional into a hollow-eyed shell of her former self. She stopped going to work entirely, calling in sick with a voice so raspy and frantic that her boss didn't even question her, likely assuming she was in the throes of a nervous breakdown. Her apartment, once a symbol of her independence, had become a prison cell where she spent her days sitting in the center of the living room with a kitchen knife in her lap, jumping at the slightest creak of the floorboards. She had pushed her heavy dresser in front of the front door, creating a barricade that she hoped would buy her a few seconds of time if the lock was breached. But deep down, she knew that a wooden dresser was no match for the obsession she saw in that man's eyes. Elena decided that she could no longer live this way, and on a Thursday afternoon, she made the frantic decision to pack a bag and flee back to Ohio the next morning. She spent the evening throwing clothes into a suitcase, not bothering to fold them, her movements jerky and adrenaline-fueled as she constantly checked the clock on the wall. The sun had set hours ago, plunging the city into darkness, and a violent thunderstorm had rolled in off the Atlantic, battering her windows with sheets of rain that sounded like handfuls of gravel being thrown against the glass. The thunder was so loud it shook the foundation of the old building, masking the usual sounds of the city and creating a chaotic auditory landscape that made it impossible to distinguish between the storm and potential danger. Around 1:30 p.m., the power in her building flickered and then died completely, plunging her apartment into a suffocating, absolute darkness that felt heavy enough to touch. Elena froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, and she fumbled blindly for the flashlight she kept in her nightstand drawer. As the thin beam of light cut through the gloom, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, she heard a sound that made her blood turn to ice, a distinct, metallic scrape coming from the window that led to the fire escape. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't the rain. It was the sound of rusted iron grinding against brick, the sound of a heavy weight shifting on the metal grate just outside her bedroom. She slowly turned the flashlight toward the window, her hand trembling so violently that the beam danced erratically across the peeling paint of the walls. For a moment, she saw nothing but the rain streaming down the glass, reflecting the lightning that flashed intermittently in the sky. But then, a flash of lightning illuminated the silhouette of a man crouched on the fire escape, his face pressed against the glass, framed by the soaking wet hood of a gray sweatshirt. "I know you're in there, Elena." A muffled voice came through the glass, low and guttural, shattering the last remnant of her hope that this was all in her head. "Open the window, or I'll break it." Elena didn't scream. Terror had stolen her voice, leaving her with only a primal instinct to survive that surged through her limbs with electric intensity. She dropped the flashlight and sprinted toward the front door, her bare feet slapping against the hardwood floor. Abandoning her plan to barricade herself in the bedroom, she reached the door and shoved the heavy dresser aside with a strength she didn't know she possessed. The wood screeching against the floor in the dark, her fingers fumbled with the deadbolt, her breath coming in short, jagged gasps. But as she turned the latch, she heard the sickening sound of glass shattering in the bedroom behind her, followed by the heavy thud of boots hitting the floor. She threw the door open and stumbled out into the hallway, not bothering to close it behind her. Fueled by the terrifying knowledge that he was now inside her apartment, the hallway was pitch black, the emergency lights having failed long ago, and she had to feel her way along the wall, her shoulder scraping against the rough plaster. "You can't run from me," his voice echoed from her open doorway, no longer muffled but clear and terrifyingly close, filled with a twisted mix of anger and delight. She didn't look back. She just threw herself at the staircase, taking the steps 2 or 3 at a time, risking a broken neck to put distance between herself and the monster in her home. As she reached the second-floor landing, she heard him sprinting down the stairs above her, his heavy boots creating a thunderous rhythm that seemed to be closing the gap with impossible speed. She reached the lobby vestibule, her hands slippery with sweat as she grappled with the heavy front door, praying that the latch wouldn't stick as it so often did. It gave way with a groan, and she burst out into the pouring rain, the cold water hitting her face like a shock to the system. She didn't stop running. She sprinted down the middle of the street, screaming for help, hoping that a taxi, a police car, or even a late-night delivery truck would appear to save her. She ran for 3 blocks without looking back, her lungs burning and her legs feeling like lead, until she saw the neon open sign of a 24-hour diner shimmering through the rain. She burst through the doors, dripping wet and hysterical, startling the few patrons and the waitress who dropped a pot of coffee in surprise. "Please, help me, he's chasing me," she screamed, collapsing onto the checkered floor, pointing a shaking finger back toward the dark, rain-slick street she had just fled. The waitress, a tough-looking woman in her 50s, immediately locked the door and pulled Elena behind the counter, while the cook emerged from the kitchen clutching a baseball bat. They waited there for the police to arrive, staring out the window into the storm, watching for the gray hoodie to emerge from the shadows. But the street remained empty, save for the relentless rain and the wind-whipping trash along the sidewalk. When the officers finally arrived, soaking wet and grim-faced, Elena was shivering uncontrollably, wrapped in a blanket the waitress had provided. clutching a mug of hot tea with both hands. She told them everything: the stalking, the phone calls, the break-in, and the man on the fire escape, her voice trembling but resolute. They drove her back to her apartment building to investigate, guns drawn, expecting to find a fugitive hiding in the shadows of the old tenements. When they entered her apartment, the scene was chaotic. The shattered window let in the rain, soaking her bed, and the dresser was still pushed askew from her desperate escape. The police searched the small studio, the bathroom, and the closet, confirming that the intruder had fled the scene before they arrived. However, as one of the officers was inspecting the bedroom, he called out to his partner with a tone of voice that made Elena's stomach drop. "Hey, Sarge, you need to see this," he said, shining his flashlight under her bed. "I don't think this guy just broke in tonight. I think he's been preparing for this for a long time." Underneath her bed, pushed all the way against the wall, where it would be impossible to see without lying flat on the floor, was a sleeping bag, a collection of empty food wrappers, and a small, battery-operated fan. But the most chilling discovery was a notebook, filled with frantic placid, scribbled handwriting detailing Elena's schedule, her outfits, and even transcripts of her phone conversations. He hadn't just been watching her from the street or breaking in when she was gone. He had been living under her bed, inches beneath her while she slept, breathing the same air, waiting for the perfect moment to make his move. The realization that the predator had been nesting mere inches beneath her sleeping body sent Elena into a state of shock so profound that the paramedics had to administer a sedative just to stop her shaking. She sat wrapped in a coarse wool blanket in the hallway, watching through the open door as the crime scene unit swarmed her tiny apartment, their flashlights cutting through the gloom like scalpels. The sanctuary she had fought so hard to maintain had been turned into a sterile laboratory of horror, with technicians dusting for fingerprints on the floorboards, where she used to walk barefoot. The air was thick with the chemical smell of developing fluid and the lingering, stale odor of the intruder, a scent Elena now realized she had been subconsciously registering for months. Detective Miller, a seasoned investigator with a weary face that had seen too much of the city's darkness, emerged from the bedroom holding the battered notebook in a plastic evidence bag. He approached Elena slowly, crouching down to her eye level, his expression a mixture of professional detachment and genuine sympathy for the young woman before him. "We're going to catch this guy, Elena, but I need to ask you some hard questions about what's in here," he said softly, tapping the bag against his knee. "The entries go back 3 months. He details your schedule, your phone calls, and he describes watching you sleep. Did you ever wake up and feel like someone was touching your hair or moving the blankets?" Elena felt the bile rise in her throat as she shook her head, unable to vocalize the horror of the violation. Realizing that the drafts she had felt were likely his breath or the movement of his body shifting beneath the frame, the police found that the intruder had carefully removed the dust cover from the bottom of the box spring, creating a hammock-like space where he could lay suspended above the floor, invisible even if someone looked under the bed from a standing angle. It was a sophisticated, practiced hiding spot, suggesting that this wasn't the first time he had done this, and that he had likely honed his craft in other apartments, with other victims who may never have realized he was there. The forensic team spent hours combing the apartment for physical evidence, but the results were frustratingly sparse, painting a picture of a ghost rather than a man. There were no usable fingerprints. The intruder had worn gloves, likely the same gray wool ones Elena had seen him wearing on the street corner, and he had been careful not to leave behind hair or skin cells in the main living areas. The only DNA recovered was from the cigarette butts found in the nest under the bed, but when they ran the profile through the state and national databases, it came back as a ghost. No matches, no prior arrests, no name to attach to the nightmare. Mr. Henderson, the superintendent, was brought in for questioning, but his grumbling indifference quickly turned to defensive panic when the police pointed out the ease with which the fire escape window could be jimmied open. He claimed he had never seen the man in the gray hoodie, despite the sentinel standing outside his building for months. A statement that infuriated Detective Miller, but offered no legal grounds for an arrest. The building's lack of security cameras meant there was no footage of the intruder entering or leaving, leaving the investigation reliant entirely on Elena's terrified memories and the physical evidence left in the lair beneath her bed. A few days later, while staying at a hotel near the airport funded by her worried parents, Elena received a call from Detective Miller that extinguished her last flicker of hope for a quick resolution. "We've hit a wall, Elena," he admitted, his voice heavy with frustration over the crackling line. "The DNA is a dead end for now. And the notebook. It ends with a plan for that night." He wasn't just watching anymore, he was escalating. The entry for Tuesday says, "The waiting is over. You got out just in time." The confirmation that she had narrowly escaped a violent fate was both a relief and a new source of trauma, cementing the fact that her survival had been a matter of pure luck rather than protection. The police did manage to trace the brand of cigarettes found under the bed to a specific cheap variety sold only in a handful of bodegas in the Lower East Side. But it was a loose thread that unraveled into nothing. The clerks didn't remember a specific man in a gray hoodie. Or rather, they remembered a dozen men who fit that description, in a neighborhood teeming with drifters and shadows. The Sentinel had simply vanished into the ether of New York City, absorbing back into the concrete and steel from which he seemed to have spawned, leaving Elena constantly looking over her shoulder, seeing his face in every crowd. As the weeks turned into months, the investigation officially went cold. The case file, collecting dust in a drawer at the precinct. Just another unsolved mystery in a city full of them. Elena moved back to Ohio, unable to walk down a city street without having a panic attack. But the psychological scars followed her across state lines. She couldn't sleep in a bed with a frame anymore, opting for a mattress directly on the floor so there was no space for monsters to hide underneath. She thought she had left the horror behind in that cramped East Village studio, until a year later, when a package arrived at her parents' house with no return address. Inside the package was a single item that made her knees buckle and her world spin, a cassette tape labeled simply "Lullaby" in the same jagged handwriting she had seen in the police evidence bag. With trembling hands, she put it into her father's old tape deck and pressed play, expecting to hear a threat or a scream. Instead, the room was filled with the sound of her own breathing, recorded from inches away while she slept, followed by a soft, raspy voice humming a distorted nursery rhyme. He hadn't just watched her, he had recorded her, keeping a piece of her as a souvenir. And somehow, he had found her again. The haunting melody of the distorted nursery rhyme filled the living room. But it was a faint, rhythmic sound in the background of the recording that made Elena's blood run cold and her father's face turn ashen. Distinctly audible behind the raspy humming was the deep, resonant chime of a grandfather clock, striking the hour of 2, a sound that was unique to the antique timepiece, standing in her parents' hallway right outside the door. "That's our clock," her mother whispered, her hand flying to her mouth in horror, tears instantly springing to her eyes as the implication settled over them like a suffocating blanket. The tape hadn't been recorded in New York a year ago. It had been recorded in this very house, likely the night before, meaning the monster had followed her hundreds of miles to her supposed safe haven. Panic erupted in the household as Elena's father grabbed his shotgun from the cabinet and her mother dialed 911, her voice cracking as she explained that a stalker was potentially inside their home. The police arrived within minutes, swarming the large suburban property with K9 units and tactical gear, treating the quiet Ohio street like a crime scene in a major metropolis. They swept the main floor and the basement, finding nothing. But when they pushed open the access panel to the attic, the police dog began to bark furiously, straining against its leash. The officers shined their lights into the dusty darkness and found it disturbing. The makeshift nest of insulation and old blankets, along with a crushed pack of the same cheap cigarettes found in the New York apartment. The intruder was gone, having likely slipped out when the package was delivered. But he hadn't gone far, as a patrol car spotted a figure walking along the dark shoulder of the county road less than a mile away. When the officer hit the lights, the man didn't run, he simply stopped and turned around, raising his hands with a chillingly calm demeanor, the flashing red and blue lights illuminating the face Elena had only seen in shadows. He was identified as Elias Thorne, a 40-year-old drifter who had worked as an unlicensed contractor in New York City for a decade, giving him access to keys, codes, and the hidden architectural secrets of countless old buildings. During the interrogation, Thorne was disturbingly cooperative, speaking about his actions with the casual tone of a man discussing a hobby rather than a campaign of psychological terror. He admitted to frogging the act of secretly living in people's homes while they're there in over 30 different apartments across the city before fixing his obsession on Elena. "She was the only one who noticed me," Thorne said with a twisted smile, staring directly at the camera in the interrogation room. "Most people are too busy looking at their phones or their feet to see the shadows. But she looked back, and that made her special." He confessed that he had followed her to Ohio, not to kill her immediately, but because he missed the thrill of the proximity, of being the invisible ghost in her life. The police obtained a warrant for a storage unit Thorne had rented in Queens, and what they found inside turned the case from a stalking incident into a legendary horror story. The unit was filled with hundreds of cassette tapes, each labeled with a name and a date, creating an auditory library of his victims' sleeping breaths and private moments. There were also boxes of souvenirs taken from the homes, jewelry, photos, locks of hair proving that Elena was merely the latest in a long line of victims who had unknowingly hosted a parasite. While most of the victims were physically unharmed, the psychological violation was so profound that many, like Elena, were forced to completely uproot their lives upon being notified by the NYPD. Elias Thorne was eventually sentenced to 50 years in prison for burglary, stalking, and a litany of other charges, ensuring that he would likely die behind bars, where he could no longer hide in the dark. However, for Elena, the incarceration of her tormentor did little to heal the fracture in her reality, or the constant paranoia that had become her shadow. She never returned to New York City, nor did she stay in Ohio, instead moving to a remote property in the Pacific Northwest, where she could see anyone approaching from a mile away. She lives alone, with 3 large dogs and a state-of-the-art security system, and she sleeps in a room with no furniture other than a mattress on the floor, ensuring nothing can ever live beneath her again. The story of the Manhattan Stowaway became a dark urban legend in the East Village, a cautionary tale told to new transplants about the dangers of old buildings and the eyes that watch from the scaffolding. It serves as a terrifying reminder that our homes are only as safe as the locks on our doors and the vigilance of our minds, and that sometimes the noises we hear at night aren't just the wind. We like to believe that when we lock our doors, we are locking the world out, keeping the danger on the street where it belongs. But Elena's story forces us to confront the much scarier possibility that sometimes, when we turn the lock and slide the deadbolt home, we aren't locking the danger out, we are locking ourselves in with it. So, the next time you are lying in bed and you hear the floor creak in the hallway, or you feel a sudden, inexplicable draft chill your skin, take a moment to look around the room. Check the closet, check the window latch, and maybe, just to be safe, grab a flashlight and take a look underneath your bed. You probably won't find anything other than dust bunnies and lost shoes. But then again, that's exactly what Elena thought, right up until the moment the monster spoke to her from the fire escape. If you enjoyed this story, please remember to give the video a like, as it really helps us grow, and hit that subscribe button to join us for more dark and mysterious stories. Until next time, stay safe, keep your eyes open, and trust your instincts. They might be the only thing standing between you and the unknown.